The History of Everything You Use, Episode 3. Sugar, the sweetness that changed history. Opening. Welcome back. Tonight we continue our slow walk through the histories of the ordinary things that fill our lives. The objects and substances so familiar to us that they have become almost invisible. In our first episode, we followed the story of salt, the mineral that built empires. In our second, we trace the journey of coffee, the bean that woke up the world. Tonight, we turn to a substance that, more than perhaps any other in this series, has changed what human beings eat, how they work, and where they live, and has done so at a cost that we are only now beginning to fully reckon with. It sits, right now, in your kitchen. It hides in your bread, your yogurt, your ketchup, your breakfast cereal, your evening glass of wine. The average person in an industrialized country consumes something on the order of 30 to 40 kilograms of it every year, a quantity that would have astonished and perhaps horrified our great-grandparents. And yet, for most of human history, this substance was rarer than gold. It was locked in the pharmacies of medieval Europe, sold by the gram, prescribed by physicians as medicine for the sick and the dying. Kings served it at banquets to display their wealth. Poets sang about it. Empires were built to produce it. Millions of human beings were enslaved to grow it. Tonight, we are going to talk about sugar. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back with mine to a time when sweetness itself was a luxury, and the world had not yet tasted what would eventually reshape it. Part 1. A world without sweetness. To understand sugar's story, we must first understand something strange about human biology. We are born loving sweetness. It is one of the very few tastes a newborn baby responds to with unmistakable pleasure. Sweet, in the natural world, almost always meant safe. Ripe fruit, mother's milk, dense calories. Bitter, by contrast, often meant poison. Our tongues carry the evolutionary memory of 1,000,000 years of foraging. But here is the thing. In the world our species evolved in, real sweetness was rare. A wild strawberry, a ripe fig, a honeycomb if you were brave enough to raid the bees. For most of human history, honey was the closest thing to a pure sweetener that anyone knew. And honey was precious. In ancient Egypt, honey was offered to the gods and paid as tax. In ancient Greece, athletes ate it before the games. In the Old Testament, the Promised Land itself is described as flowing with milk and honey. And this was not a small compliment. Honey was, for most people in most places, a luxury enjoyed only occasionally. There were other, humbler sources: dates in the Middle East, maple sap in North America, in China, malted grain syrups, but nothing yet resembling the fine white crystals that would eventually pour from a supermarket bag. And then, on a river valley in ancient India, someone discovered how to crystallize the juice of a tall, jointed grass. Part 2. The grass that changed everything. The plant we call sugarcane is a giant among grasses, thick-stemmed, taller than a man, with leaves like green blades. It probably originated in New Guinea, where local peoples had chewed its sweet stalks for thousands of years. From there, it spread slowly westward, through Southeast Asia, and eventually to the Indian subcontinent. It was in India, sometime in the first millennium BC, that the crucial breakthrough occurred. Someone, history has not preserved a name, figured out how to press the juice from the cane, boil it down, and cool it into hard brown lumps of crystallized sugar. The Sanskrit word for these lumps was shakara, meaning gravel or grit. From this word, along an extraordinary linguistic journey, comes the Arabic sukar, the Latin saccharum, the Persian shekar, the Turkish sheker, the French sucre, the English sugar. Every time you speak the name of this substance in almost any European language, you are echoing an ancient Indian word for grit. The Greek admiral Nearchus, who travelled with Alexander the Great to India in the 4th century BC, brought back one of the earliest Western descriptions of the plant. He wrote of a reed that produces honey without bees. For centuries, this remained the standard European description. A mysterious eastern reed, a plant that somehow made honey without any insect at all. Meanwhile, in India, sugar and its refinement became a well-developed science. Physicians of the Ayurvedic tradition prescribed it as medicine. Cooks used it in delicate sweets. And by the time of the Gupta Empire, around the 5th century AD, Indian sugar was travelling along trade routes to Persia, to China, and beyond. Part 3. Sugar and the Islamic World. The great transmitter of sugar to the Mediterranean was the Islamic civilization. When Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th and 8th centuries, they carried with them not only a new religion, but also a passionate curiosity about agriculture, botany, and medicine. Wherever they conquered, they brought new crops, and in Persia they found sugarcane, and they fell in love with it. Over the following centuries, Arab agronomists carried sugarcane across the entire Mediterranean world. They planted it in Egypt, along the Nile. They planted it in North Africa. They brought it to Sicily and to southern Spain, where it thrived in the warm coastal plains around Valencia and Granada. They developed the technical processes for refining it, the boiling houses, the clay pots, the successive stages of crystallization that could turn dark syrup into gleaming white sugar loaves. And they made it, alongside coffee and roses, one of the great sensory pleasures of the medieval Islamic world. Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo had confectioners producing elaborate sweets. Persian and Arabic poets wrote love verses in which the beloved's lips were compared to sugar. Rulers offered sugar sculptures, carved into the shapes of animals, palaces, or entire miniature gardens, as gifts to visiting ambassadors. In the medieval Islamic world, sugar was already what it would later become in Europe, a marker of wealth, refinement, and hospitality. And then came the Crusades. Beginning in 1096, waves of European soldiers marched into the eastern Mediterranean, and there they encountered sugar for what was, for most of them, the first time. Chroniclers of the First Crusade wrote wonderingly of the sweet reeds the local people cultivated, and of the honey-like substance they made from them. Crusaders sucked on cane in the fields around Tripoli and Acre, and when they returned home to Europe, they brought back the taste, and slowly, the demand. For the next several centuries, sugar was a rare and precious import in Europe. Imported from the Levant and Egypt, sold through Venetian and Genoese merchants at extraordinary prices. It was so expensive that it was kept, quite literally, under lock and key. Wealthy households in medieval Europe had a piece of furniture called a sugar chest, a small, sturdy wooden box with an iron lock in which the family's supply of sugar was stored like jewellery. Only the head of the household held the key. Part 4. Sugar as medicine. For the medieval European mind, sugar was not primarily a food. It was a medicine. Medieval medicine, inherited from the Greek physician Galen, held that the human body was composed of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on balancing them. Different foods had different humoral qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry. Sugar was classified as warm and moist, and considered helpful for a wide range of conditions. Physicians prescribed it for coughs, for chest complaints, for weakness after illness, for wasting diseases. It was compounded into syrups, mixed with bitter medicines to make them palatable, ground into lozenges for sore throats. The word syrup itself, and the word sherbet, and the word julep all derive from Arabic pharmaceutical terms in which sugar played a central role. Even today, the pharmacies of the world sell many medicines coated in a hard sugar shell, a distant memory of the era when a spoonful of sugar was not just a treat, but a prescription. There is a well-worn medieval proverb of doubtful origin but widely repeated, like an apothecary without sugar. It was said of a man who lacked the very tool of his trade. Sugar was, quite literally, the pharmacist's most essential ingredient. And yet, precisely because it was so expensive and so rare, sugar remained largely out of reach for ordinary people. A peasant in 14th century France or England might taste sugar only a handful of times in a lifetime, perhaps at a great wedding or a lord's feast. Sweetness in daily life still meant honey or dried fruit or nothing at all. But the demand was rising, and the Mediterranean plantations of the medieval Arab world could not meet it forever. Europe wanted more. Part 5. The Atlantic Turn. The transformation of sugar from a rare medicine into a mass commodity began, quietly, on some small islands in the eastern Atlantic. Madeira, the Canary Islands, São Tomé, where Portuguese and Spanish colonizers in the 15th century began experimenting with something new. These islands were subtropical, warm and rainy. They had rich volcanic soil. They were closer to Europe than the eastern Mediterranean, but they had almost no local population that could be forced to work. And so, when the Portuguese set up sugar plantations on Madeira in the 1450s, they made a fateful decision. They imported enslaved labourers from West Africa. This was the birth of what historians now call the Atlantic sugar slavery complex. On these small, remote islands, three previously separate things came together for the first time: European capital and management, sugarcane, the labour-intensive crop of the East, and enslaved African labour. It was a template, a working model, that would soon be transported on a scale almost too large to comprehend across the Atlantic to the Americas. Christopher Columbus himself, who had lived on Madeira and married the daughter of a Madeiran sugar planter, carried sugarcane cuttings to the Caribbean on his second voyage in 1493. The cane grew astonishingly well. The Portuguese planted it in Brazil beginning around 1516. The Spanish planted it in Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola. The English, French, and Dutch would follow, with plantations of their own in Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Suriname. And with the cane came, in staggering numbers, the enslaved. Over the course of roughly 3.5 centuries, from the early 16th to the mid-19th, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade. Of those, historians estimate that roughly 2/3, perhaps as many as 2 out of every 3, ended up working, directly or indirectly, in the sugar economy. This is a fact worth pausing on. Cotton is the crop most people associate with slavery, but sugar came first, and sugar took more lives. On the sugar islands of the Caribbean, mortality rates among the enslaved were catastrophic. On some Barbadian and Jamaican plantations in the 17th and 18th centuries, an enslaved person's average life expectancy after arrival was as short as 7 or 8 years. The work was brutal: cutting cane under a tropical sun, feeding the crushing rollers of the mill, tending fires in the boiling houses where mistakes meant burns or death. And the plantation economy was structured, coldly, around the assumption that it was cheaper to replace enslaved workers by continuing to buy new ones than to keep the existing ones alive. This is not a comfortable story. It is not a story that fits neatly into the sweet, gleaming aesthetic of a jar of sugar on a modern kitchen counter. But the sugar in that jar has a history, and this is a large part of it. Part 6. The Triangle Trade. The economics of sugar reshaped the entire Atlantic world into a system so vast that historians call it, simply, the Triangle Trade. Picture it as a great triangular flow. From European ports, Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Amsterdam, ships sailed south with manufactured goods, cloth, guns, iron bars, glass beads, alcohol. They crossed to the coast of West Africa, where they traded these goods to African merchants and rulers in exchange for enslaved captives. Loaded now with a human cargo, the ships turned west and sailed the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. A voyage of 6 to 8 weeks, in conditions of unimaginable horror, during which roughly 1 in 6 of the captives died. Those who survived were sold at auction in Caribbean and American ports. Then, the ships loaded up with what the enslaved had produced. Above all, sugar and molasses and rum, but also tobacco, coffee, indigo and cotton, and sailed back north and east to Europe. There, the sugar was refined, sold, and consumed. The profits funded new voyages. The cycle turned again. Every corner of this triangle transformed the places it touched. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol grew wealthy on the trade. Bordeaux and Nantes built magnificent townhouses. The great sugar refining industries of London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg employed thousands. Insurance markets, shipping firms, and financial institutions expanded to serve the trade. Modern global capitalism, in a very real sense, was rehearsed and perfected in the sugar economy. And what did Europe get in return, apart from the profits? A slow but unstoppable revolution in the European diet. Because as sugar production expanded and prices fell, sugar began, for the first time in history, to reach ordinary people. Part 7. A new kind of food. In the late 17th century, England imported roughly 1,000 tons of sugar a year. By the middle of the 18th century, this had risen to 20,000 tons. By the middle of the 19th, it was around 500,000 tons. Per capita sugar consumption in Britain rose from a fraction of a kilogram per person per year in 1700 to roughly 40 kilograms per person per year by 1900. A 40-fold increase in 2 centuries. Something quite new was happening. Sugar was slipping out of the pharmacy and the aristocratic banquet and into the everyday kitchen of the working classes. It combined with 3 other new imports, tea, coffee, and chocolate, to produce a set of habits that would come to seem timeless within a single generation. Tea with sugar, coffee with sugar, sweetened chocolate, jam on bread, puddings, cakes, biscuits. The rise of the British sweet tooth and the parallel rise across Northern Europe and North America was one of the most dramatic dietary transformations in human history. And it happened in less than 2 centuries. The historian Sidney Mintz, in his classic study of sugar, argued that this transformation was not merely gastronomic, it was economic. A cup of sweet tea, taken with a slice of bread and jam, was a cheap, quick, energy-dense meal that could be prepared in minutes and eaten cold. It was, in effect, industrial food. Food perfectly suited to feeding factory workers whose long shifts left them little time or money to cook. Sugar became one of the fuels of the Industrial Revolution, not because it powered machines, but because it powered the workers who tended them. Consider the strange loop this produced. Sugar was grown by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. It was shipped to Europe. It was consumed, sweetening tea and porridge, by British workers labouring 12 hours a day in cotton mills. And the cloth those mills produced was, in part, shipped back to West Africa to trade for more enslaved people. Sugar, cotton, and slavery formed a single interlocking system, a system so profitable that it drove much of the growth of the early industrial economy, and so brutal that had inspired the first great human rights movement of the modern age. Part 8. Abolition and beet sugar. By the late 18th century, the moral horror of slavery was gathering into an organised political movement. In Britain, a small group of Quakers, Anglicans and Evangelicals, including William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and the formerly enslaved writer Olaudah Equiano, began a decades-long campaign against the slave trade and against slavery itself. Sugar was at the centre of their argument. They toured the country with diagrams of packed slave ships. They organised boycotts of West Indian sugar. Consumers, especially women, began in the 1790s to refuse to buy slave-grown sugar and to seek out sugar from India instead, marketed as free-grown. The British slave trade was abolished in 1807. Slavery itself in the British Empire was abolished in 1833. France, having briefly abolished slavery in 1794, restored it under Napoleon and finally ended it in 1848. Portugal, Spain, and the Dutch followed at different points. Brazil, the last major slaveholding country in the Americas, ended slavery only in 1888, and its sugar and coffee economies had leaned on enslaved labour almost to the very end. But even as slavery was retreating, a technological revolution was quietly changing sugar forever. In 1747, a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf had shown that sugar could be extracted not only from tropical cane, but from a temperate root, the sugar beet. Marggraf's discovery was a curiosity for half a century, but during the Napoleonic Wars, when the British Navy blockaded continental Europe and cut off Caribbean sugar imports, Napoleon threw imperial resources behind beet sugar as a strategic industry. By 1811, French factories were producing beet sugar in commercially significant quantities. After the wars ended, the beet sugar industry did not fade. It flourished across France, Germany, Belgium, and eventually Russia and Eastern Europe, protected by tariffs and subsidies. By 1900, more than half of the world's sugar was being grown from beets in temperate Europe, not from cane in the tropics. It was a strange kind of triumph, a triumph that had nothing to do with the abolitionist movement, but that nonetheless broke the tropical plantation's monopoly on the world's sweet tooth. The sugar in a European kitchen in 1900 was more likely to have come from a field in Silesia or northern France than from an island in the Caribbean. Part 9. Sugar in the modern world. Sugar consumption kept rising through the 20th century, and by the middle of the century, something even stranger began to happen. Sugar started disappearing from the front of the pantry, only to reappear inside almost everything else. In the second half of the 20th century, the food industry underwent a revolution. Prepared, processed, and packaged foods became the dominant form in which people in wealthy countries bought their meals. And food scientists discovered, over and over, that sugar did remarkable things beyond simply sweetening. Sugar preserved. Sugar bulked out cheap ingredients. Sugar masked the off flavors of low-quality fats and proteins. Sugar, above all, made people want more, an effect that food scientists came to talk about, only half joking, in terms of the bliss point. The result is a paradox. The average person in an industrialized country today probably consumes less sugar out of a sugar bowl than their grandparents did. But they consume vastly more sugar overall because it is hidden in bread, in cured meats, in salad dressings, in yogurt, in sauces, in soft drinks, and in 1,000 other places where earlier generations would never have thought to look. In the 1970s, the invention of high-fructose corn syrup, a cheap sugar-like sweetener derived from corn, poured cheap sweetness into the American beverage industry on a scale never before seen. And with this transformation came a slow, grinding public health disaster. The rise of obesity, of type 2 diabetes, of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, of dental decay, all trace in part to the extraordinary quantity of sugar now embedded in modern diets. The World Health Organization has, in recent years, urged people to reduce their added sugar intake to less than 10% of their daily calories, and ideally less than 5%. Most people in wealthy countries consume far more than that. Some jurisdictions have begun to fight back. Mexico, the United Kingdom, and several other countries have introduced sugar taxes on soft drinks. Some cities have banned soda in schools. Food labels have been redesigned to make hidden sugar more visible. Whether these efforts can shift a habit built up over 3 centuries remains to be seen. Part 10. The weight of sweetness. Let us step back for a moment and consider what sugar has done. It began as a rare medicine, prescribed by physicians in small doses. It became a marker of wealth, displayed at royal banquets and hidden in locked chests. It drove Europeans to plant tropical islands with a labour-hungry crop and to enslave millions of Africans to grow it. It reshaped the Atlantic world, redrew the map of colonial power, and produced enormous wealth for a small number of European ports. It fueled the first great human rights campaign in modern history, the movement to abolish slavery. It transformed the diet of billions of people, from something occasionally sweet to something continuously so. And in our own time, it has become a slow, invisible threat to human health, present in almost everything we eat, hard to see and hard to escape. No other item we have discussed in this series has come at such a human cost. Salt was taxed harshly. Coffee was harvested in its dark centuries by enslaved labour as well. But sugar, more than any other commodity, was built on the sustained, industrial-scale enslavement of human beings. Every teaspoon of white sugar consumed in 18th century London had, quite literally, a story of forced labour behind it. That story is not something we should forget when we lift the sugar bowl at breakfast. And yet, sugar also gave us something. It gave us the birthday cake and the wedding cake, the family recipe passed down through generations, the small pleasure of a piece of chocolate on a hard day. It is deeply woven into the ritual, celebratory, and comforting parts of human life. To tell the story of sugar honestly is to hold both of these things at once, the joy and the grief, the sweetness and the weight. Closing. And so we return, one more time, to the ordinary, to the small white grains that sit right now in your kitchen. They look so innocent, but you know their story now. You know that they began on a river valley in ancient India and travelled with Arab agronomists across the Mediterranean. You know that they were, for centuries, kept in locked chests and prescribed by physicians. You know that they lured Europeans across the Atlantic and turned tropical islands into vast plantations, and that they cost the lives of millions of enslaved Africans. You know that they fed the workers of the Industrial Revolution and inspired one of the great moral movements of modern history. You know that they now hide, quietly, inside almost everything you eat. Sugar teaches us the darker lesson of this series, that ordinary things are not innocent, that the small pleasures we take for granted have, sometimes, been paid for at costs we have chosen not to see, and that the honest history of what fills our kitchens is also a history of who we have been. The next time you stir a spoonful into a cup, remember for just a moment the long journey those small crystals have made, from a grass in the Indian sun, through Arab boiling houses and Venetian counting rooms, across an ocean paid for in human suffering, into an industrial kitchen, and finally into your hand. Sleep well, and when we meet again, we will follow the story of one more of the great transformers of daily life, the humble loaf of bread, whose 10,000 years of history is, in a sense, the history of civilization itself. Until then, good night.